John Locke. Now, we've already looked at Hobbes, we've looked at, before that we looked at Machiavelli, and we've examined the turn, as it were, towards modern political philosophy. But nobody encapsulates modern political philosophy, in my opinion, or in at least mainstream ideas about governance and society as much as John Locke, who is a 17th century political philosopher, also considered just generally a philosopher of empiricism, and also considered sometimes, to have written on political economy, that is on economics. He lived from 1632 to 1704, and in relation to Thomas Hobbes, his writings influence and are influenced in turn by the Glorious Revolution of 1688. What that Glorious Revolution of 1688 was that in 1648 the Parliament had overthrown the king. The son of the king came back and overthrew the Parliament, and then finally in 1688 the House of Commons and the Royalists came to an agreement and said, "Tuanu vi kuch nahi kehnde, tusi sanu vi kuch na kehna." And that's how England got its constitutional monarchy, which is basically that it has a constitution, but it also has a monarchy, and everybody's always going crazy about Prince William, क्या नाम है उसका, जिसने वो ब्याह कर लिया हॉलीवुड एक्ट्रेस से, क्या नाम है उस हॉलीवुड एक्ट्रेस का, सॉरी, प्रिंस हैरी मेट सैली, और ब्याह उसने किसे किया है? मेगन मार्कल तो नहीं है? अच्छा, और देखा ना, सबको पता है, मुझे नहीं पता मगर इनको पता है. So everybody in England is crazy about, they treat their royalty much like we treat Imran Khan. They can do no evil. We lack a royalty, that's why we had to construct one. Anyway, so it is the Glorious Revolution of 1688 which brought together the Parliament as well as the royalty into an arrangement whereby the royalty would also remain and Parliament would also remain. And the real theorist of that Glorious Revolution is this man here, John Locke. Now, as I've already told you, he's a philosopher, he's also a physician, and if there's anyone that can be considered the father of modern liberalism or classical liberalism, it would be John Locke, which is why, of course, I said that he is really the fountainhead of Desi libtards. Sorry, I shouldn't use that term. Desi liberals. He is also the father of British empiricism, empiricism being the idea in philosophy that everything that we know from our experience, from our senses. He is one of the most influential of the Enlightenment thinkers, and of course his social contract theory is the social contract theory that we today accept to be sort of the main sort of school of thought. But he's also very much known for his writings on philosophy, that is epistemology, the theory of knowledge, on economics, and on political philosophy. He in turn has influenced incredibly influential people like Voltaire, like Rousseau, and also the Scottish Enlightenment, and you might even be surprised to discover that he had a very big influence on the American revolutionaries and in fact on the writing of the US Declaration of Independence. For Locke, as opposed to Hobbes, if you remember from Hobbes, the state of nature was one that was nasty, brutish, and it was short. It was a situation, it was a dog-eat-dog world. It was a situation where there was war of all against all. But for John Locke, this is not the case. He says, if you remove the state, ये कोई ज़रूरी बात नहीं है कि हर बंदा जो है वो आपस में पागलों की तरह लड़े. और सर तैमूर रहमान ने जो आर्ग्यूमेंट दी थी कि बच्चे आपस में लड़ते हैं, they are after all बच्चे तो आपस में लड़ेंगे. But when you talk about adults, if you leave the room and you have a group of adults, they are not going to start hitting each other with things and start doing silly things like that. They know how to conduct themselves. Why is it that in the state of nature we don't start killing each other, we don't start slitting each other's throats, we don't start coming into a war of all against all? He says because we are governed, even when we are not governed by a law that is created by the state, by a legal juridical law, we are nonetheless governed by a law of nature. And that law of nature is that no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty or possessions, because all men desire mutual love. They want to be loved and they want to love in turn He's a bit of a touchy-feely, lovey-dovey, tree-hugging liberal. So he thinks all men desire love, and but sometimes conflict can occur. But do you remember this movie called this movie called Fight Club? Has anybody seen Fight Club? Okay, so in Fight Club, this guy goes absolutely crazy, and he starts imagining himself as this big fighter and this really sexy sort of dude. That's basically he begins to imagine himself as Brad Pitt, and then he puts together a team of people, and he says to them, "What I want you to do is I want you to go and pick a fight with anybody, just for any reason." So एक बंदा होता है वो अपने पौधों को पानी दे रहा होता है, एक बंदा सांस से गुजरता है, उसके ऊपर वो पानी गिरा देता है, जानबूझ के पानी गिरा देता है, क्यों? ताकि उसके साथ लड़ाई शुरू हो जाए। एक बंदा कॉफ़ी लेके जा रहा था, उसकी कॉफ़ी गिरा देता है, क्यों? ताकि लड़ाई शुरू हो जाए। And he says to his peers, he says to his followers, कि you'll soon discover that actually man is quite risk averse and they will not fight. In fact, you will be so shocked to discover that, शायद they may sort of बुरा भला मुंह से आपको कहेंगे, but it will take a lot for you to actually begin a fight. Why? Because fights are risky, and you can get hurt in a fight very easily. And people don't want to take risk. In fact, people don't want to get into a situation where they encounter pain, or they can potentially encounter pain. Yes? मैं यही आगे जोक मारने जा रहा था कि Fight Club, if it was made in Pakistan, would have had a very different ending. But be that as it may, I think the point nonetheless may be valid. Maybe we are super hyped up to fight because, if you've been driving through traffic and traffic is terrible, उसके बाद वैसे ही आपका पारा चढ़ा होता है, कोई आके आपको यूं घुरी भी करा देता है, आप कहते हैं बस सारी जो जिंदगी की फ्रस्ट्रेशन है इस बंदे पे मैंने कुसून मार के निकालनी है. So so maybe it's the case that we're already quite revved up because of the situation. But if that were not the situation, if we had really existed in a state of nature where things were relatively calm, we lived with nature, we lived in nature, it was not necessary that we would just break out and start fighting like crazy. And I think one of the presentations on Thomas Hobbes also pointed out that, look, societies, if you look at anthropology, you look at history, you know that societies have existed without the state. And it's not that they started fighting and killing each other. For instance, the American Indians, the Red Indians, they didn't have a state as such, right? They didn't have, a government or a state in the sense that we think of the state today. And yet it's not the case that the Red Indians were constantly slitting each other's throats. The Aborigines of Australia, we know about, they didn't have a state, they were not slitting each other's throats. We know about the tribes that have existed in Balochistan and in faraway places in interior Sindh and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and so on and so forth, where there is no presence of the state at all, and yet they are not slitting each other's throats. We know also of African tribes, Shaka, Zulu, and so many other great African tribes that exist. Well, Shaka Zulu was more or less a state, but we know of many African tribes that existed without a state, and they lived pretty much peacefully. It's not the case that every tribe that existed without a state was fighting each other. And then there is also the paradox that if we are inevitably going to fight each other without a state, then how did the state come about? The argument that the state comes about out of self-preservation seems a bit weak, since why wouldn't self-preservation then just get people not to kill each other in the state of nature, right? If self-preservation is the only issue, then they should just stop killing each other, like John Locke says. So Locke continues, the offender declares himself to live by another rule than that of common reason and equity, and so becomes dangerous to mankind. So it's not the case that people will not fight each other. There may be some people who offend the law of nature and say, okay, oh, I'm going to take this and I'm going to take that and I'm going to, declare war on my fellow man, etc. Or main usse chin lunga, flani cheez. So it may be the case that some people, even in the state of nature, may break the law of nature, but by doing so, they automatically put themselves up in opposition to everybody else, and also to common reason and equity. So that therefore means that by violating the law of nature, the law of equity, the law of this common reason, they in fact give society the right to punish those who violate the law of nature. If we all lived without a state and I stole something that belonged to you, or I did you some wrong, and then you said, sir has done me wrong, he took something of mine that ought to have belonged to me, or I was walking down the corridor and sir came along and slapped me on the back of my head for no rhyme or reason. Well, what would all of you say? Well, you'd probably go F and badmouth me first and foremost. But aside from that, you'd all say, you know what, sir has done you wrong, you have the right, and we all have the right now to punish sir for his transgression, mainly by going on LDF and saying bad things about him. So what that means is that when somebody breaks the law of nature, he or she gives society the right, therefore, to punish them. And these things happen normally. Even in tribal society, where there is no state, you have a tribe, or in hunter-gatherer, pastoralist societies, where one person is seen to violate the law, तो सारे मिलके उसको कहते हैं, ये तूने बड़ा गलत किया है, बड़ी बुरी हरकत की है. It even happens in groups of friends, right? I mean, अगर आप सारे यहाँ पे बैठे हुए हैं और किसी ने कोई बड़ी बुरी हरकत की, तो सारे उसे कहेंगे कि यार ये तूने बहुत ही घटिया किस्म की हरकत की है, ऐसे तो करना नहीं चाहिए था, वगैरह वगैरह, right? And you see that you don't need the state, you don't need a policeman to come and tell you that, says John Locke. So where the law of nature is violated, Locke says, a common injury is done, and the individual or individuals who have been damaged have the right to seek reparations for him that has done it. So उसके पास ये हक हो जाता है कि भाई मेरे साथ ज़्यादती हुई है, अब मेरे साथ जो ज़्यादती की गई है वो पूरी की जाए. Passionate heat or boundless extravagance against a criminal instead of common reason and proportionate punishment to transgression, however, also become possible. So it may be the case कि आपने कोई छोटी मोटी बुरी हरकत की हो, और मगर जब आपके खिलाफ हो सकता है कि आप कोई फेमस पर्सनैलिटी हो या इनफेमस पर्सनैलिटी हो, और जब आपने कोई ऐसी हरकत की हो जो कि नाजेबा हरकत हो, तो आपको पनिश करने वाले बहुत सारे लोग हों, और ये भी मुमकिन है कि एक बंदे को ज़्यादा पनिशमेंट मिल जाए, दूसरे बंदे को कम पनिशमेंट मिल जाए. एक बंदे को छोटी सी सज़ा के लिए इतनी बड़ी, छोटी सी गुनाह के लिए इतनी बड़ी सज़ा मिल जाए, दूसरे बंदे को एक बहुत बड़े गुनाह की कोई सज़ा ही ना मिले. Thus, every man in the state of nature has the power to kill a murderer, both for deference as well as for security. The law of nature allows it. Okay, if I am going to try and commit murder against you, you have the right to stop me from committing murder. But there is a problem in the state of nature, and that problem is, let no man be a judge in his own case. Please write that down. It's a beautiful phrase, and it's the crux of why John Locke thinks state of nature doesn't work. He says it is unreasonable for men, and we can extend this to women as well, to be judges in their own cases. That self-love will make men partial to themselves and to their friends. I love myself. An injury to me always feels like an injury that is far more exaggerated than an injury to somebody that I don't know, or an injury to one of my friends, or my wife, or somebody I love, or my children will seem to me to be far more, it will hurt me emotionally, and it will seem to be very, very big for me, और मेरा दिल चाहेगा कि इसको तो मैं निचोड़ दूँ, इसका तो मैं किला कुम्मा कर दूँ पूरी तरह से, right? अगर मुझे ही ये हक मिल जाए कि मैंने ही दूसरे की सज़ा मुकर्रर करनी है, और किसी ने लेट से ज़ारा को चपेट करा दी या बदतमीज़ी कर दी, तो मैं तो कहूँगा इसका हाथ ही काट दो, मैं कहूँगा इसको फांसी चढ़ा दो, क्योंकि मुझे अपनी बेटी से इतना प्यार है, तो मैं कहूँगा कि इस बंदे को माफ़ी नहीं करना. एंड हो सकता है कि आई एम वेरी वेरी जुडिशियस, और ऐसे नहीं इसकी इतनी सज़ा बनती है, इसको भी एक चंड करा दो. मगर लाइकलीहुड यही है कि जब मैं अपने केस में कोई फ़ैसला करूँगा, तो मैं चाहूँगा कि अगले को सख्त से सख्त, कड़ी से कड़ी सज़ा जो है वो सुनाई जाए. और अगर कोई ऐसा बंदा हो जिसके बारे में मुझे कोई परवाह नहीं, तो मैं कहूँगा आई डोंट रियली केयर. And on the other side, that is nature, passion and revenge will carry them to extremes, punishing others, and hence nothing but confusion and disorder will follow, and that therefore God had suddenly appointed government to restrain the partiality and violence of men. So self-love means that you should not be a judge in your own case, or you should not be a judge in the case of your friends, because you are liable to punish that person far greater than that person deserves. This kind of stuff can happen on social media, for example. On social media, अगर आपने किसी दूसरे को कोई बुरा भला कहा है और या उसने आपको बुरा भला कहा है और आपके सोशल मीडिया पे बहुत सारे दोस्त यार हैं, यू आर अ पॉपुलर पर्सन ऑन सोशल मीडिया, जब आप उसको अटैक करते हो तो लाइक बीज ऑल योर फ्रेंड्स कम अराउंड और फिर वो उसकी वो सोशल मीडिया हेजिंग करते हैं कि जिसकी हद हिसाब कोई नहीं. आई मीन बट यू नो वो पीटीआई वाले और मुस्लिम लीग वाले तो अपनी सियासत ही पूरी इस तरह कर रहे हैं कि मतलब तू पटवारी और तू व्हाट्स द अदर फॉर पटवारी जो भी बन कबाब वगैरह जो भी है. So I mean they are in a, what do you call it, they are sort of, I mean there's nothing but social hazing each other, right? And if you're going to be a judge in your own case, you're going to want to do more and more of that. It can also happen in other instances where you don't have an impartial judge, but you have, let's say, somebody on social media, some famous person is attacked on social media, but you already have a prejudice against that famous person. Let's say, for example, that famous person is black and you're in white America and you're resentful of the fact that Michael Jackson has become so popular being a black person. There was, in fact, an FBI did an investigation in which they said that it is likely that Michael Jackson may be attacked because he is a very prominent black individual and because there is the existence of racism in the United States of America. Therefore, we fear that Michael Jackson may be attacked, his reputation may be attacked, and so on and so forth. And so they did an entire investigation on that. And were the cases against Michael Jackson for child abuse and so on, which were never proven in court, but there was an out-of-court settlement, but that doesn't mean he is necessarily guilty. Maybe he just wanted to stay out of court and so on. Does that, did he do it? Did he not do it? We really don't know. But the possibility also exists that when you are extremely famous and extremely rich, that somebody may try to frame you because they think they can get money out of that. That also happens, right? They may try to frame you, or they may try and accuse you because the result of the publicity may in turn make you a public figure, and that may be very good for you. So such things can happen and do happen all the time with what do you call it, celebrities, and celebrities know about it, which is why they become very careful about their privacy and about who they interact with and who they don't interact with. So how do we solve this problem, asks John Locke. Civil government is the proper remedy for the inconvenience of the state of nature, which must certainly be great where men may be judges in their own cases. Absolute monarchs are but men, where one man commanding a multitude has the liberty to be judge in his own case and may do all his subjects whatever he pleases without the least question or control of those who execute his pleasure. So monarchy is a very bad situation, says John Locke, because in a monarchy, the monarch has complete control and his word is the law. And so in any political situation, he becomes the sole judge, jury, and executioner. And out of self-love, the monarch will not necessarily, somebody asked this question the other day, why would the monarch, according to Hobbes, not fall into the trap of doing things that are only beneficial to the monarch? So that's exactly Locke's argument, that a monarch who's completely unchecked, there is no check and balance on him, out of self-love will always think that मेरी policy ठीक है, चाहे एशियन डेवलपमेंट बैंक ये कहे कि अगले साल पाकिस्तान की इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ 2.8% पे स्लो डाउन हो जाएगी, मुबारक हो आप सब लोगों को, मगर फिर भी मोनाक ये कहेगा कि मेरी मुआशी पॉलिसी जो है ना वो ठीक है, बाकी सारी मुआशी पॉलिसियाँ गलत थी, even if all evidence points in the opposite direction. Why? We can't help it. Self-love biases us always to side with ourselves. Think about your own self कि किसी ने आप पे तनकीद की हो मगर आपको बड़ा वक्त लगा होगा उस तनकीद को कबूल करने में. या think about politics as a whole. इंडिया और पाकिस्तान के दरमियान डिबेट हो रही थी यूनाइटेड नेशंस में. पाकिस्तान इंडिया पे तनकीद कर रहा था और जो पाकिस्तान इंडिया पे तनकीद कर रहा था मेरे ख्याल में काफ़ी हद तक वो दुरुस्त बातें थी. और जो तनकीद इंडिया ने फिर पाकिस्तान पे की, अगर आपने वो सुनी हो तो उसमें चंद बातें से मैं बिल्कुल इत्तेफाक नहीं करता, मगर उसमें भी बहुत सारी बातें ऐसी थीं जिसके बारे में सोचना पड़ेगा और कहना पड़ेगा कि यार शायद ये बातें दुरुस्त हों। किसी दूसरे पर तनकीद करना हमेशा ज़्यादा आसान है, अपने आप पर तनकीद करना हमेशा ज़्यादा मुश्किल है। This goes for a country, this goes for a community, and this goes for the individual as well. Why does that happen? John Locke tells us it's self-love. So, is the state of nature real? All princes and rulers of independent governments are in a state of nature, in the sense that the international relations is like in a state of nature. But only a compact of agreeing together mutually to enter into one community and make one body politic makes man free from the state of nature. So what we decide is we're going to come together and we are going to make a government, and the purpose of government is that you need to have a neutral judge. Somebody needs to judge a case that is not interested in that case one way or another. They are not your friend, there is no conflict of interest, they are not pre-programmed to think कि ये ठीक कह रहा है या वो ठीक कह रही है because of the color of their skin or because of their gender or because of their race or nationality or language. इसीलिए वो justice का symbol क्या है कि justice is blind. It doesn't look at who you are, it only weighs the evidence in your favor or against you, and it is supposed to make that judgment impartially without prejudice to against you or prejudice in your favor. And that idea is very much the idea of John Locke. Locke ये कहता है कि but he proceeds from there. He says we have to understand the principle of property. What is property? This has to be understood very clearly. He says the earth was given to mankind in common. खुदा ताला ने हमें ज़मीन जो दी और ये जो कायनात जो जिसके अंदर हम रह रहे हैं, ये किसी एक फ़र्द को तो नहीं दी, या आप जब पैदा हुई थी तो आपके ऊपर कोई साथ सर्टिफिकेट तो नहीं था जो आपने साथ ही बाहर निकाला होगा, डॉक्टर साहब ये मेरी ज़मीनें होंगी, ये मेरी जायदाद होगी. No such thing happened, right? All the fruits of nature belong to mankind in common, says John Locke. जो कुछ भी कुदरत से हमें मिलता है वो तमाम इंसानों के लिए है, किसी इंसान की उस पर इजारादारी खुदा की तरफ से नहीं है. God has given man reason to make use of the earth to the best advantage of life and convenience. आपको अकल खुदा ताला ने दी है किस मकसद के लिए? इस मकसद के लिए कि आप इस ज़िंदगी में अपनी ज़िंदगी बेहतर करें. Every man has property in his own person. तो सबसे पहले आपका वो जो फेमिनिस्ट कहते हैं ना मेरा जिस्म मेरी मर्जी, that's actually pretty bad translation of my body my will, but being that as it may, first and foremost you have your own self, you have your own body, your mind, etc., and that by God belongs only to you. Maybe by human actions you become enslaved to others, but God didn't create the institution of slavery. When you were born into this world, you were born free. So that means that every man, woman has property in his own person. The labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are properly his or her. जो आप अपने हाथों से मेहनत करते हैं वो आप ही की मेहनत है. Whatever then he removes out of the state that nature had provided and left in, he had mixed his labor with and joined to it something that is his own and thereby makes it his property. जब आप कुदरत से कोई चीज़ जो है, जब आप कुदरत से कोई चीज़ निकालते हैं, कुदरत के से कोई चीज़ डेवलप करते हैं, फल जो है दरख्तों से उतारते हैं, जो ज़मीन है उसकी काश्तकारी करते हैं, तो आप अपना खून पसीना जो है उस मिट्टी के अंदर मिला रहे हैं, आप अपनी मेहनत उस मिट्टी के अंदर मिला रहे हैं. और जब आप अपनी कोई चीज़ उस मिट्टी के अंदर मिला रहे हैं तो उस चीज़ से जो चीज़ पैदा हो रही है वो आपकी होनी चाहिए. क्यों आपकी होनी चाहिए? क्योंकि आपकी मेहनत से वो चीज़ बनी है. इट इज़ फ्रॉम योर लेबर and from the mixing of your labor with what exists in nature that that thing has been created. Hence that thing ought to belong to you. He says, labor, if the first gathering made them not his, nothing else could. जब आपने कोई आम इकट्ठा किया, कोई फ्रूट इकट्ठा किया, आप दरख्त पे चढ़े, आपने वहाँ से जाके प्लक करके आप नीचे लेके आए, तो किसका होना चाहिए? ये मेरा दोस्त, क्या नाम था आपका? तस्मीर कहता है नहीं सर, मुझे नहीं परवाह कि आप दरख्त पे चढ़ के ये आम लेके आए, ये आम मेरा होना चाहिए, मीठा है, मुझे बड़ा पसंद है। मगर आप सब कहेंगे नहीं यार तस्मीर भाई, ये यार कोई फेयर बात नहीं है, बेचारे सर चढ़े थे दरख्त पे, गिर भी सकते थे, हड्डी भी टूट सकती थी, इतनी मुश्किल से जाके उन्होंने आम जो है पकड़ा है। यार तू जाके खुद अपना आम पकड़ ले, वो तेरा होगा। अगर हाँ वॉलंटरली सर तुझे आम दे दें तो वो उनकी मर्जी है, मगर तुझे छीन के नहीं लेना चाहिए, ज़बरदस्ती नहीं लेना चाहिए, ये उन्हीं का आम बनता है। So that's what Locke is saying. Labor put a distinction between them and that which was common. यानी जब जिस चीज़ पे मैंने अपनी मेहनत की है, अब वो चीज़ मेरी होनी चाहिए, अब वो कॉमन प्रॉपर्टी नहीं है। पहले खुदा ताला ने हर चीज़ कॉमन में बनाई है, वो दरिया, वो दरख्त, वो खूबसूरत पहाड़, वो नदियाँ, वो वादियाँ, जहाँ पे आप कहते हैं तेरी वादी वादी घूमूं, तेरा कोना कोना चूमूं, वो सब खुदा ताला ने आप सब के लिए कॉमन में बनाई है। मगर जब उसके अंदर कोई किसी दरख्त में किसी जगह पे आप अपना लेबर ऐड करते हैं तो फिर वो चीज़ आपकी बन जानी चाहिए, वो फिर कॉमन प्रॉपर्टी नहीं रहती, उस पर फिर आपका हक हो जाता है। His labor has taken it out of the hands of nature where it was common and belonged equally to all her children and has thereby appropriated it to himself. तो उसकी मेहनत की वजह से वो उसकी बन गई। But there are limits of property, और ये भी नेचुरल लॉ से निकलते हैं, खुदा ताला के कानून या कुदरत के कानून से बात निकलती है। Nothing was made by God for man to spoil or destroy. अगर आप किसी चीज़ पे ऐसी मेहनत कर रहे हैं जिसके नतीजे में वो चीज़ तबाह और बर्बाद हो रही है, तो that would not be a good thing. We wouldn't even consider that to be mehnat. We would consider that to be a destructive act. If somebody is going and cutting down a tree, not for any productive reason, or burning crops, or burning land, or burning forests, etc., not for any productive but for just for fun, then everybody will say कि यार क्या कर रहे हो, क्यों ये कुदरत की खूबसूरत चीज़ें जो है वो तबाह बर्बाद कर रहे हो, इनका ख्याल करो। सो गॉड डिडंट मेक ऑल ऑफ दीज, ये जो नेमतें खुदा ताला ने दी हैं ये इस मकसद के लिए तो नहीं दी कि आप उनको तबाह बर्बाद कर दें। Environmentalists, of course, that is their argument, that we have been destroying nature, we have not been taking care of nature. As much land as a man tills, plants, improves, cultivates, and can use the product of, so much ought to be his property, he says, is his property. He by his labor does, as it were, enclose it from the common. So if I say कि ये सारी ज़मीन, ये 25 मुरब्बे ज़मीन मेरी है, मगर 25 मुरब्बे ज़मीन पे मैं क्लेम तो कर लेता हूँ, मगर उसमें सिर्फ 10 मुरब्बे ज़मीन जो है मैं यूज़फुली इस्तेमाल करता हूँ, बाकी 15 मुरब्बे एम ही पड़े हुए हैं, उनका मैं कुछ कर ही नहीं पा रहा हूँ, वेस्ट हो रहे हैं वो। तो what would John Locke say? He would say कि that land was not made by God. You didn't add your labor into it, and that land was not made by God to be wasted. So therefore, you should not consider it your property because you have failed to mix your labor into it and you have failed to use it productively. God had commanded man to labor, and the penury of his condition required it of him. Penury का मतलब होता है the poverty of his condition. Okay, we come into this world, we need food, clothing, and shelter. He that subdued, tilled, and sowed any part, thereby annexed to it something that was his property, which another had no title to, nor could without injury take from him. अगर मैंने किसी चीज़ पे मेहनत की तो वो मेरी बन जाती, वही बात दोबारा। Now this creates the beginning of political society, the state. In the state of nature, men are free, equal, and independent, and it is only by consent that we all agree to create a political society. That means we agree to create a state. Since the political community is one body made of consent, it is necessary the body should move that way whether the greater force carries it, which is the consent of the majority. क्योंकि हमारे आपस के कंसेंट से, हमारे आपस के इत्तफाक से हमने रियासत बनाई। क्यों बनाई रियासत? इस मकसद के लिए बनाई कि भाई in the state of nature there is a problem. The problem is कि अपने केस में we will not be very good judges. We need an impartial person, an impartial authority to judge in any given dispute between us. So we create, by consent, we say, okay, we are going to create an institution that is going to judge and arbitrate between us. And that is going to be our political society. मगर क्योंकि हमने अपने इत्तफाक से वो चीज़ बनाई है, किसी ने हम पे फोर्स नहीं किया, हम उसके ऑथर हैं, by social contract हमने अग्री किया है, therefore the condition also remains कि जो भी वो कानून बनाए वो कानून भी हमारे इत्तफाक से, हमारे कंसेंट से ही बने, जिससे उसकी मुराद ये है कि majority opinion ought to be ought to carry the weight. Minority opinion की बात नहीं सुनी जाए, majority is authority. अगर अक्सरियत ये कहती है कि चोरी करना, डाका डालना जो है वो जुल्म ज़्यादती है, तो फिर वही कानून होना चाहिए. The act of the majority passes for the act of the whole. ये भी नहीं कि अगर 70% लोग ये कहते हैं कि जी चोरी करना बुरी बात है, 30% लोग कहते हैं कि चोरी करना बुरी बात नहीं है, तो ये नहीं होगा कि 70% लोगों के लिए चोरी करना बुरी बात होगी और 30% लोगों ने क्योंकि अप्रूव ही नहीं किया तो उनके लिए बुरी बात नहीं होगी. सबके लिए फिर वो बुरी बात होगी. जो मेजॉरिटी का व्यू बनेगा वो फिर सोसाइटी का ओवरऑल व्यू बन जाएगा. So we come up with the idea of majority rule. Whosoever unites into a community must give up all the power necessary to the ends for which they unite into society, to the majority of the community, unless they expressly agreed in any number greater than the majority. He says, जब हम एक community बनाते हैं consent की बुनियाद पे, तो जो majority है उसी का opinion जो है वो community का opinion होगा. मगर इस पे भी एतराज़ किया जा सकता है और ख़ास तौर पे 2 एतराज़ात किए जा सकते हैं. बट हैज़ गवर्नमेंट एवर बीन सेट अप दिस वे? क्या हुकूमतें वाकई इस तरह बनी? हमने तो ये देखा कि जंग के नतीजे में बनी और तरह से बनी. Men are born, दूसरा ऑब्जेक्शन ये हो सकता है कि men are born under the pre-existing government and do not have the liberty to begin a new one. मतलब आपने कोई, जब आप 18 साल के हुई आप, तो आपसे किसी ने ये तो नहीं पूछा डू यू अप्रूव द कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन ऑफ पाकिस्तान, ये पूरा आइन पढ़ लें, ये कानून पढ़ लें, ये PLO पूरा कानून पढ़ लें, क्या आप अप्रूव करते हैं? किसी ने आपसे नहीं पूछा. आप इस मुल्क में पैदा हो गई और बस मुल्क का कानून था और आपको फॉलो करना पड़ा. तो फिर इसके बारे में क्या कहता है लॉ? कहता है Individuals in the Commonwealth are ignorant of their own birth and infancy. पहली बात तो ये कि आपको पता ही नहीं आपकी सोसाइटी और जो पॉलिटिकल स्टेट है वो कैसे बना. All governments begin with the social contract, even though sometimes governments violate that social contract. मगर शुरुआत हर हुकूमत की एक समाजी मुआहदे से ही होती है. Political societies all began from a voluntary union and the mutual agreement of men freely acting in their choice and their governors and forms of government. So if you go back into time, you will discover that for every given society, John Locke says, the state began as a voluntary contract. And secondly, men are naturally free. Governments are created by the consent of the people. So yes, it's true that nobody asked you individually whether you want this or that particular law, मगर आपकी शुरुआत जो रियासत की शुरुआत है वो एक consent की ही बुनियाद पे हुई है. And this brings us to the idea of the sufficient declaration of consent. There is what he says, tacit consent. You may not have given your explicit consent. You may not have said, yes, I approve of all the laws of the government of Pakistan. But whosoever by inheritance, purchases, permission or otherwise, enjoys any part of the land so annexed to and under the government of that commonwealth must take it with the condition it is under, that is, of submitting to the government of the commonwealth under whose jurisdiction it is as far forth as any subject of it. देखो, जब आप पैदा हुए आपने कानून का तो आपने ये तो शायद नहीं कानून पूरा और कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन पढ़ा, मगर आपने कुछ चीज़ें इनहेरिट की, आपने कोई ख़रीदो फरोख्त की, आपने जो फैसिलिटीज़ गवर्नमेंट ने आपको बना के दी वो आप बचपन से अच्छी हों या बुरी हों वो आप बचपन से उनको इस्तेमाल तो कर रहे हैं. और बिकॉज आप उन चीज़ों को इस्तेमाल कर रहे हैं और उन कवानीन की वजह से आप उनको इस्तेमाल करने में कामयाब हैं, इसका मतलब ये है कि आपने चाहे एक्सप्लिसिटली तो कंसेंट नहीं दी मगर टैसिटली आपने अपनी कंसेंट दे दी है. अगर आपको वो चीज़ें वो कानून कबूल नहीं थे तो फिर आपको उन कवानीन के नतीजे में जो फ़वाइद थे वो भी नहीं उठाने चाहिए थे. जब आपने उस सोसाइटी में रह के उन चीज़ों का फ़ायदा उठाया जो इस रियासत ने आपको दी, तो आपने टैसिटली, जॉन लॉक सेज, उस रियासत उस कानून को कंसेंट दे दी अपनी. सो if a man sets aside his possessions, अगर आप समझते हैं कि जी मैं कंसेंट नहीं देना चाहता पाकिस्तान के आइन को, मैं इस आइन को दुरुस्त नहीं समझता, तो आपको क्या करने की ज़रूरत है? कहता है if a man sets aside his possessions, he is at liberty to go and incorporate himself into any other commonwealth or agree with others to begin a new one in any part of the world they can find free and unpossessed. आप अपनी जायदाद छोड़ दें, अपनी प्रॉपर्टी छोड़ दें और कहें देखें जी मुझे पाकिस्तान का कानून नहीं पसंद, मुझे पाकिस्तानी होना नहीं पसंद, मुझे पाकिस्तान का आइन नहीं पसंद या इंडिया का है जहाँ भी आप पैदा हुए हैं, तो ठीक है, लॉक कहता है कि आपके पास ये राइट है, आप अपनी जायदाद सारी छोड़ दें और आप चले जाएं, क्योंकि वो जायदाद, वो प्रॉपर्टी आपको मिली ही एक सोशल कॉन्ट्रैक्ट के नतीजे में। वो ना होता तो वो आपकी कभी प्रॉपर्टी हो ही नहीं सकती थी, राइट? सो यू कैन लीव योर पोजेशंस एंड देन यस यू आर फ्री टू गो एंड मेक अ सोशल कॉन्ट्रैक्ट आइदर विद सम अदर गवर्नमेंट. You can say, I want to be citizen of Canada, or you can even start your own government on some place with some friends जहाँ पे कोई पहले बंदा नहीं रहता. तो ये आपकी मर्जी है. बट द प्री कंडीशन फॉर दैट इज कि वो आसाइश जो कि आपको, वो प्रिविलेजेस, वो चीज़ें, वो पोजेशंस, वो तमाम हकूक़ वगैरह, वो तमाम चीज़ें जो आपको इस पर्टिकुलर सोशल कॉन्ट्रैक्ट के नतीजे में मिली हैं, उनसे आपको दस्तबरदार होना पड़ेगा. उनको आपको you will have to give up on those things. So, in this way, consent must be positive engagement, an express promise and compact. In other words, John Locke wants us to have a positive engagement with your social contract. You should know the law, should participate in the law, as as he says, the majority opinion becomes the law, and therefore you must participate in the act of governance to make laws, to build laws, to develop laws, to move laws forward. He doesn't want you to be passive citizens and just sit at home and say, yes, the law exists, I can't do anything about it. But you are the author of the law, and you can change the law, you can change the social contract if the majority of people agree with you. A society that is misgoverned may not then be able to sustain if the state is not really a neutral arbiter the way John Locke envisions it. If it is unable to protect the life and property of people, if it is unable to fulfill its purpose, then you will get a situation, if it is not driven by the consent of the majority but becomes the preserve of a super rich elite, as is depicted in the movie, right? So then a situation may emerge that state will not enjoy any kind of real legitimacy, but will become a symbol of hatred. And that's not what Locke wants at all. He wants the state. He thinks that the purpose of government is to create peace, to create safety, and to create the public good for people. And we know this, right? We talk about this all the time in governance and politics, and when we talk about good governance, we say the state is supposed to be a neutral arbiter, it's supposed to create peace and safety and the public good, etc. So he looks at the various forms of state that exist in his time. There is perfect democracy, he says, oligarchy, not just in his time but in history. The perfect democracy, oligarchy, hereditary monarchy, elective monarchy, and mixed forms of government. And he says, by commonwealth, I must be understood all along to mean not a democracy or any form of government, but any independent community, which the Latin signified by the word civitas, to which the word best answers in our language is commonwealth, and most properly expresses such a society of men, which community does not, for they may be subordinate communities in a government, and city much less. So Locke and Kant and many others writing in this period distinguish between democracy and a republic. And their main argument is for a republic, a society ruled by the law. What would be the powers of the Commonwealth? The supreme power is, of course, first and foremost to legislate. There remains in the people the supreme power to remove or alter the legislative when they find the legislative act contrary to the trust reposed in them. In other words, you should be able to remove the government if the government is not doing what you wanted it to do. Thus, the community perpetually retains a supreme power, power to the people. The people really ought to have power in this sort of situation. But this power of the people can never take place till the government be dissolved. While the government is present, you cannot exercise that power. But you can change the government through elections, etc., in order that it may act in your interest. If all of this sounds awfully familiar to you, it sounds really, really familiar to you because this is the way this is the mainstream theory about how government should function. You've all heard this before, right? There's nothing really fundamentally new that I'm saying over here, I think. And that's because Locke that shows you how influential Locke is in the modern world, because before he comes about, this is not the conception of government. Allegiance is nothing but obedience according to law, which when he violates, he has no right to obedience. If the state follows the law, if the government follows the law, you are required to be obedient to the law. But if the government does not follow the law, then that is the end of obedience. He has no will, no power, but that of the law. That means the sovereign has no will or power except the will and power given to him by the law. Now this means that executive power is not unchecked as it is in Thomas Hobbes. The executive has a share in legislative power, but is visibly subordinate and accountable to it, and may be at pleasure changed and displaced. So the executive of the state, that is the prime minister or president, depending on what kind of system you have, is subordinate to the legislature. The legislature makes the law, the executive implements that, but the executive is always subordinate to the legislature. And if the legislature, the parliament, feels that the prime minister is not doing what the parliament has asked it to do, the parliament can change the prime minister. If you feel that you made a prime minister, the prime minister is not doing what you want him to do, what he has been asked to do by the law, the legislature has the right to change the prime minister. Using force upon the people without authority and contrary to the trust put in him that does so is a state of war with the people, who have a right to reinstate the legislative in the exercise of their power. The use of force without authority always puts him that uses it into a state of war as the aggressor, and renders them liable to be treated accordingly. In other words, if you overthrow the constitution of Pakistan, if you overthrow the legislature, you tell it to go home, you are a military dictator, you have taken government by force of arms, then you have in fact declared war against society. You are the rebel, you have broken the law, and for breaking the law, you are liable to be punished. This is very radical stuff, people. Because once you have a law, you have a constitution, it means that anybody who violates the constitution is committing treason and can be punished accordingly. The power of assembling and dismissing the legislature does not give the executive a superiority over it, but is the trust placed in him for the safety of the people in a case where the uncertainty and variableness of human affairs could not bear a steady fixed rule. So in other words, yes, the executive has the, calls the parliament to session and so on and so forth, but he has no power to dismiss the parliament, to send the parliament back home. In Pakistan, there you can see that we have done this many, many times, sent prime ministers. We've had 27 prime ministers, and I'm not sure whether there's any prime minister that has managed even to complete their term. We want fair and equal representation also, says Thomas Hobbes. It is in the interest of the people to have fair and equal representation. Things of this world are in constant flux. Representation becomes very unequal and disproportionate. The people must be represented in proportion, and the executive must ensure the rectification of any disorder. In other words, from any given constituency, if there are X number of people, then they ought to be an equal number, or a proportionate number rather, of representatives of those people. ये नहीं होना चाहिए कि कराची में 10 लोग हैं तो वो उन 10 लोगों के 100 legislatures हों और किसी पूरे बलोचिस्तान का एक legislature हो. That would not be fair, right? The numbers have to add up, they have to be equal. How can the government be dissolved? It can be dissolved obviously by foreign conquest. That means कि वो, it's been taken over by some other government. When anyone or more shall take upon them to make laws whom the people have not appointed so to do. अगर कोई ऐसा बंदा खड़ा हो जाता है कहता है कि मैं कानून बनाऊंगा जिसको कि लोगों ने elect नहीं किया, जो लोगों का नुमाइंदा नहीं है, तो that means government is actually dissolved. They make laws without authority which the people are not therefore bound to obey. अगर किसी ने वोट लेके वो नहीं आया तो उसके पास अथॉरिटी नहीं है कानून बनाने की, और आप अगर उस कानून को नहीं फॉलो करते तो इसमें कोई आपकी बुराई नहीं, क्योंकि आपने उसको ये राइट ही नहीं दिया था कि वो कानून बनाए. The people may constitute a new legislative and resist the force of those who without authority would impose anything upon them. आपके पास ये भी हक है कि आप नई पार्लियामेंट बना लें. आप कहें ये तो किसी मिलिट्री डिक्टेटर की पार्लियामेंट है, किसी बादशाह की पार्लियामेंट है, हम इसको कबूल ही नहीं करते, ये हमारी नुमाइंदा है ही नहीं. If a single person or prince sets up his own authority as arbitrary will in place of the laws which are the will of society. So अगर प्रिंस या हेड ऑफ स्टेट कोई अपना कानून बना ले जो कि लेजिस्लेटिव से अप्रूव नहीं है, वो भी नहीं काबिल कबूल. इफ द प्रिंस हिंडर्स द लेजिस्लेटिव फ्रॉम असेंबलिंग इन ड्यू टाइम और फ्रॉम एक्टिंग फ्रीली परसुएंट टू दोज एंड्स फॉर विच इट वाज कॉन्स्टिट्यूटेड. अगर प्राइम मिनिस्टर, प्रिंस, प्रेसिडेंट, मिलिट्री डिक्टेटर जो है वो पार्लियामेंट को बैठने ना दे, सेशन ना करने दे, तो फिर भी उसने वायलेट किया है. पार्लियामेंट का सेशन जो है वो इतना ज़रूरी है. इफ़ द इलेक्टर्स और वे ऑफ इलेक्शंस आर ऑल्टर्ड विदाउट द कंसेंट एंड कॉन्ट्री टू द कॉमन इंटरेस्ट ऑफ द पीपल. अगर इलेक्शन का कानून जो है वो लोगों के राय के से इख्तलाफ करते हुए, तजावज़ करते हुए, उनके जो उन्होंने मैंडेट दिया है उसके खिलाफ जाते हुए इलेक्शंस के कानून तब्दील कर दिए जाएं, तो भी इसका मतलब है गवर्नमेंट इज टेक्निकली डिसॉल्व्ड. इफ द पीपल आर डिलीवर्ड फ्रॉम सब्जेक्शन ऑफ फॉरेन पावर, if the executive power neglects and abandons that charge so that the laws can no longer be put in execution. जहाँ पे कानून की पासदारी नहीं की जा रही, कानून को ओबे नहीं किया जा रहा, एग्जीक्यूटिव जो है वो कानून को नाफिज ही नहीं कर रहा, वहाँ पे भी गवर्नमेंट हैज टेक्निकली ब्रोकन डाउन. When the legislative or the prince acts contrary to the trust of the people, जो हमने एतमाद उनको दिया उसके खिलाफ वो चलना शुरू कर दें, तब भी डिसॉल्व है. If they invade the property of the subject and make themselves master of the lives, liberties and fortunes of the people, अगर वो नाजायज़ तरीके से आपकी जायदाद पे काबू पा लें, आपको गुलाम बना लें, आप पे काबू पा लें, तो ये कतई तौर पे काबिल कबूल नहीं. Whenever the legislatures endeavor to take away and destroy the property of the people or to reduce them to slavery under arbitrary power, they put themselves into a state of war with the people who are thereupon absolved from any further obedience. फिर आपके पूरे ये कोई मैंडेट नहीं है कि आप उनकी बात कबूल करें अगर वो आपकी नाजायज़ तरीके से आपकी प्रॉपर्टी को छीन रहे हैं, आपको गुलाम बनाने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं. If the executive power employs force, treasure and offices of the society to corrupt the representatives and gain them to his purpose, अगर वो लेजिस्लेचर को करप्ट करे, अगर वो लेजिस्लेचर को बाय ऑफ करे, फोर्सफुली उसके साथ कोई उसका ओपिनियन चेंज करने की कोशिश करे, or openly pre-engages the electors and prescribes to the choice such whom he has by solicitations, threats, promises or otherwise won to his design, and employ them to bring in such were promised beforehand what to vote and what to enact. अगर वो इलेक्शन के प्रोसेस में पहले ही वो कैंडिडेट्स फील्ड करे और बाकी कैंडिडेट्स को एलिमिनेट कर दे जो उसके मनपसंद के कैंडिडेट्स हों, और वो इलेक्शन के प्रोसेस को फ्री एंड फेयर इलेक्शन होने ना दे, तब भी वो गवर्नमेंट लेजिटिमेट नहीं समझी जाती. लोग पूछ रहे हैं उससे कि सरकार ये तो आपने, थॉमस हॉब्स ने तो हमें कोई हक ही नहीं दिया था रिबेल करने का. थॉमस हॉब्स तो ये कहता था कि मौत के जब कटहरे में खड़े होगे तब शायद तुम्हारे पास ये हक हो कि तुम हुकूमत की बात ना कबूल करो, मगर आपने तो बड़ी लंबी फहरिस्त बना दी है जिस बड़ी हमें पसंद भी शायद आपको आ रही हो, मगर ऑन द वन हैंड आपको पसंद आ रही है, मगर ऑन द अदर हैंड आप ये सवाल भी पूछेंगे तो सर इस तरह तो हर वक्त ही लोग जो हैं वो इनकलाब करते कूकते फिरेंगे. तो लॉक क्या जवाब देता है? ग्रेट मिस्टेक्स इन द रूलिंग पार्ट, many long and inconvenient laws and all the slips of human frailty will be borne by the people without mutiny or murmur. In other words, हुकूमतें अक्सर बहुत इस तरह की हरकतें करती हैं, मगर लोग जो है ना सब्र से कहते रहते नहीं नहीं ठीक है, अभी चांस दो, अभी तो सिर्फ 1 साल हुआ है, कोई मसला नहीं है, वगैरह वगैरह. Men by entering into society and civil government have excluded force and introduced laws for the preservation of property, peace and unity amongst themselves. Those who set up force again in opposition to the laws do rebel, that is, bring back again the state of war, and we have the right therefore. It's not that we are the rebels, he says. We are not rebelling against the state, they are the rebels. बिकॉज हमने एक कानून बनाया था, एक सिस्टम बनाया था, उन्होंने उस पूरे सिस्टम को अपने बुटों तले रौंद दिया है, तो रेबल हम कम से हुए? हम तो सिस्टम को रिस्टोर कर रहे हैं. वो कानून जो हमने बनाया था अपने कंसेंट से उसको रिस्टोर कर रहे हैं. दे दैट इंट्रोड्यूस अ पावर व्हिच द पीपल हैज नॉट ऑथराइज्ड actually introduce a state of war. उन्होंने हमारे खिलाफ जंग कर दी है. If any mischief come in such cases, अगर इसके नतीजे में कोई खून खराबा हुआ, it is not to be charged upon him who defends his own right, but on him that invades his neighbor. भाई अगर उसने कानून तोड़ा है किसी मिलिट्री डिक्टेटर ने और उसके नतीजे में फसाद हुआ है कहीं पे सोसाइटी में और लोगों की जान माल को खतरा हुआ या पीपल गॉट बीटन अप और डाइड एक्सेट्रा, किस पे जिम्मेदारी आती है? आवाम पे जिम्मेदारी नहीं आती. जिम्मेदारी उस मिलिट्री डिक्टेटर पे आती है, उस यूजर्पर पे आती है, या उस प्रिंस पे आती है, या उस बंदे पे आती है कि जिसने कानून और आइन तोड़ के जो है वो कब्जा किया है. The end of government is the good of mankind. End से मुराद ये, the purpose of government is the good of mankind. The rulers should be sometimes liable to be opposed when they grow exorbitant in the use of their power and employ it for the destruction and not the preservation of the properties of the people. आप कह रही थी थोड़ी सी एनआरकी भी होनी चाहिए, अच्छी बात है. लॉक भी ये कह रहा है कि हाँ, अगर हुकूमतें जो हैं वो करप्ट हो जाएं, वो रिप्रेजेंटेटिव गवर्नमेंट्स ना हो, वो मेजॉरिटी की विल को प्रूव ना करें, वो लूट घसूट की हुकूमतें बन जाएं, वो कानून की पासदारी ना करें, वो फोर्स इस्तेमाल करें, आपको इंस्लेव करें, आपके प्रॉपर्टीज़ और ज़िंदगियों को महफूज करने के बजाय आपको गैर महफूज कर दें, तो ऐसी हुकूमतें या ऐसे फ़र्द जो कि जिन्होंने हुकूमतों पे कब्ज़ा कर लिया है, उन्होंने आपके ख़िलाफ़ जंग डिक्लेयर कर दी है, उन्होंने आप सोसाइटी के खिलाफ रेबल किया है, और यू आर नॉट लायबल टू obey their laws. In fact, you ought to rebel against them. You ought to stand up and reassert government. But it is not that he's an anarchist in the sense that he doesn't want any government to exist, but he wants a true representative democratic government to exist. But who shall judge? कौन फैसला करेगा कि हुकूमत ने ठीक किया या नहीं ठीक किया, क्या वाकई वो यूज अप कर रही है या नहीं? Who shall judge? He says the people, obviously. अवाम ने फैसला करना है, लोगों ने फैसला करना है, सोसाइटी ने फैसला करना है कि ये हुकूमत जो है वो ठीक चल रही है नहीं चल रही. For who shall be judge whether the trustees or deputy acts well according to the trust as reposed in him? But he who deputes him and must by having deputed him have still the power to discard him when he fails in his trust. अगर मेरे खिलाफ कोई पर्चा हो जाए, मेरे खिलाफ कोई केस हो जाए और मैं कोई वकील करूं कि भाई मेरी वकालत आप जाके कोर्ट में करें, और वो मेरी वकालत ठीक ना करे, तो मेरे पास ये हक तो है ना ये कहने का कि ये अच्छा वकील नहीं था भाईजान, मैं इसको चेंज कर रहा हूँ, भाई थैंक यू वेरी मच, आप घर जाएं, मैं किसी और वकील को लेकर आ रहा हूँ. मेरे पास ये राइट है ना. इसी तरह आप हुकूमत को भी समझें. हुकूमत आपकी वकील है. हुकूमत को आपने एक ड्यूटी दी है, एक काम दिया है, एक जिम्मेदारी दी है, एक रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी दी है, और रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी ये दी है हम आपको टैक्स भी अदा करेंगे, आपको कोई काम नहीं करना, आपको काम ये करना है कि आपको हमारी जान और माल की हिफाजत करनी है. और अगर आप उस जान और माल की और कानून वो बनाना है जो हमारे कंसेंट से बने, मेजॉरिटी की कंसेंट से बने. अगर इसके कोई खिलाफ एक्ट होगा और अवाम ये फैसला करेगी, अगर अवाम सो नहीं रही है, मेरी आपकी तरह अगर अवाम सो ना रही हो, तो अवाम ये फैसला करे कि उठो जागो और ये जो हुकूमत हरकतें कर रही है ये हमारे बनाए हुए कानून के खिलाफ है, तो फिर अवाम के पास ये राइट है टू बी द जज, द फाइनल जज अबाउट वेदर अ गवर्नमेंट इज ट्रूली बीइंग representative or not. If this be reasonable for individuals, why should it be otherwise in that of the greatest and most important moment, where the welfare of millions is concerned, and also where the evil, if not prevented, is greater and the redress very difficult, dear and dangerous. जहाँ पे millions of लोगों की वकालत हो रही हो, पूरी समाज की वकालत हो रही हो, वहाँ तो और भी ज़रूरी है कि आपके पास ये हक हो कि आप कह सकते हैं नहीं, this person has not done a good job in representing who we are as Pakistanis and ought to be replaced if the majority so agrees. Finally, the power that every individual gave the society when he entered into it can never live up to the individual again as long as the society lasts, but will always remain in the community, because without this there can be no community, no commonwealth, which is contrary to the original agreement. The final power is always with the community. It is a power that we delegate only to the government. When any miscarriage of those in authority, this power is forfeited, or at the at the determination of time set, it reverts to society, and the people have the right to act as supreme and continue the legislative in themselves or place it in a new form or new hands as they think good. अगर 5 सालों के लिए हुकूमत दी है तो 5 सालों के बाद it reverts back to the community, और हम जो है वो इलेक्शन करेंगे और फिर से किसी ना किसी को ये हक देंगे कि वो हमारी नुमाइंदगी कर सके.